The crack of the whip split the evening air like thunder as Abigail stumbled backward, her sequined costume torn and her face streaked with tears. The ringmaster's cruel laughter echoed across the dusty lot where Buckley's traveling menagerie had set up camp just outside Willowbrook Township. "Dance faster, you worthless creature," Silas Buckley snarled, raising his whip again. "The crowd paid good money to see a show, not watch you shuffle around like a dying mule." Clay Brannigan had been watering his horse at the creek when he heard the commotion. Something about the sound, part performance, part genuine distress, made his jaw clench. He'd seen plenty of traveling shows come through these parts, but this felt different. Wrong. Through the canvas flaps of the main tent, he could see a young woman with auburn hair cascading down her back, her movements graceful. Despite the obvious fear in her emerald eyes, she wore the costume of a dancer, but her spirit seemed as caged as the tired lions pacing in their wooden wagons nearby. "Please, Mr. Buckley." Abigail's voice trembled as she pressed a hand to her ribs where the whip had caught her. "I'll do better tomorrow. I just need the whip cracked again," this time catching her shoulder. She cried out, and something primal stirred in Clay's chest. He'd always been a man of few words and fewer impulses, but watching this beautiful woman being tormented ignited a fire he'd never felt before. Without thinking, Clay vaulted over the rope barrier and strode into the tent. His weathered hands, hardened by years of ranch work, caught Buckley's wrist mid-swing. "I reckon that's enough," Clay said, his voice deceptively calm. At 6'3", with shoulders broad as a barn door, he cut an imposing figure even in his simple work clothes. Buckley's eyes widened, then narrowed with cunning. "This here's private property, Cowboy. The girl belongs to me, signed contract and everything." "Nobody belongs to anybody," Clay replied, his grip tightening until Buckley winced, "especially not for beating." Abigail stared at this stranger who'd appeared like an answer to her desperate prayers. For 3 years, she'd been trapped with Buckley's show, promised fame and fortune, but given only cruelty and captivity. Her parents had died of fever when she was 17, leaving her vulnerable to Buckley's false promises. "You can't just take her," Buckley protested, trying to wrench free. "She owes me money, room and board, costume costs, training fees." Clay's eyes, blue as winter sky, never left the ringmaster's face. "How much?" $200, Buckley declared, clearly inflating the number, without hesitation. Clay reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. He counted out the bills, his entire savings from 2 seasons of hard work, and dropped them at Buckley's feet. "There, she's free." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. This stranger had just purchased her freedom without even knowing her name. As she watched, as Clay turned to face her, his expression gentle despite the strength radiating from his frame. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his worn hat, "name's Clay Brannigan. I've got a horse outside and a mind to get you somewhere safe. That is, if you're willing." Looking into his honest eyes, Abigail felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. She nodded, unable to find words for the gratitude overwhelming her heart, as they walked out of that cursed tent together. Neither could have imagined that this moment would be the beginning of a love story that would become legend in Willowbrook Township. The ride to Clay's ranch passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves and the gentle creak of saddle leather. Abigail sat behind him on his sturdy mare, Juniper, her arms tentatively encircling his waist. She could feel the steady strength of him, so different from the weakness and cruelty she'd known with Buckley's crew. "You didn't have to do that," she finally whispered as they crested a hill overlooking the valley where Clay's modest homestead nestled among cottonwood trees. "Yes, I did," he replied simply. "No woman deserves to be treated like livestock." The ranch wasn't much to look at: a small log cabin, a weathered barn, and a corral where a few horses grazed in the moonlight. But to Abigail, who'd spent years sleeping in a cramped wagon surrounded by the stench of animal cages and unwashed performers, it looked like paradise. Clay helped her down from the horse, his calloused hands gentle on her waist. "It ain't fancy," he said, suddenly self-conscious about his humble home, "but it's clean, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need." Inside, the cabin was sparse but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, Flanked by handmade furniture that spoke of long winter evenings and patient craftsmanship, Clay lit a lamp, and Abigail could see the care he'd taken with his home-braided rugs on the plank floor. Shelves lined with well-worn books and wildflowers in a mason jar on the wooden table. "There's a wash basin behind that curtain," Clay said, nodding toward the far corner, "and I'll find you something proper to wear." While Abigail cleaned herself up, Clay rummaged through his belongings until he found his mother's old trunk. She'd passed 5 years ago, but he'd kept her things, somehow knowing they might be needed someday. He pulled out a simple blue dress that would fit Abigail's slight frame. When she emerged from behind the curtain, Clay's breath caught. Without the garish makeup and revealing costume, Abigail was breathtaking in a way that had nothing to do with performance. Her auburn hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her green eyes held a natural beauty that no amount of stage paint could enhance. "Thank you," she said, smoothing the dress. "I haven't worn anything this modest in 3 years." Clay busied himself at the stove, heating leftover stew. "What's your full name, if you don't mind me asking?" "Abigail Mercy Whitmore," she replied, settling into a chair at his table.
Ow.
"I was born in Tennessee, but my parents brought me west when I was small. They died of fever in Kansas City, and that's where Buckley found me." As they shared the simple meal, Abigail told Clay her story, how Buckley had promised her work as a seamstress for his show, then gradually forced her into performing when he discovered her natural grace. How the contract she'd signed in her grief and desperation had become a prison. How she'd tried to escape twice, only to be dragged back and punished. "I thought I'd die in that tent," she admitted, tears threatening. "Every night I prayed for someone to help me, but I'd given up hope." Clay reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You're safe now."
I give you my word on that.
That night, Clay gave Abigail his bed and made himself a pallet by the fire. As she lay in the darkness, surrounded by the scent of cedar and the distant sound of cattle lowing, Abigail felt peace for the first time in years. But more than that, she felt something stirring in her heart, a warmth that had nothing to do with the quilts covering her and everything to do with the honorable man sleeping by the hearth. Clay, for his part, stared at the dying embers and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He was a simple rancher, content with his solitary life. But something about Abigail Whitmore made him want to be more than he was. To build something worth sharing. Neither of them slept much that night, but for the first time in either of their lives, insomnia felt like a gift. Morning came with the crow of Clay's old rooster and the smell of coffee brewing. Abigail woke to find the cabin empty but warm, a plate of biscuits and jam waiting on the table beside a steaming cup. Through the window, she could see Clay in the corral, working with a spirited black colt. She watched him move with quiet confidence, never forcing the animal, but somehow convincing it to trust him. There was poetry in the way he worked, a gentle strength that made her pulse quicken. When he caught sight of her in the window, he touched the brim of his hat in greeting, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. After breakfast, Clay showed her around the property. The ranch had been his father's, he explained. Passed down when the older man decided to try his luck in California gold country. Clay had expanded it slowly, building the horse herd that was now his primary source of income. "I break and train horses for folks in town," he said, as they walked past the pasture where a dozen animals grazed. "Nothing fancy, just good, reliable mounts for working folks." Abigail noticed how he talked about his work with pride but without boasting. Everything about Clay Brannigan spoke of quiet competence and deep roots. It was so different from the flashy temporary world she'd known with the traveling show. "Could I help?" she asked suddenly. "I mean, I don't know anything about horses, but I could cook or mend things." Or Clay stopped walking and turned to face her. "Abigail, you don't owe me anything. What I did last night wasn't meant to put you in debt." "I know," she said, meeting his gaze. "But I've spent 3 years being useless, just a pretty decoration for other people's entertainment. Do something real, something that matters." He studied her face, seeing the earnestness there. "All right then. But we start slow. Horses can sense fear or uncertainty from a mile away." That afternoon, Clay introduced her to Juniper, the gentle mare who'd carried them both home. Under his patient guidance, Abigail learned to brush the horse's coat and pick stones from her hooves. Her movements were tentative at first, but as the horse nuzzled her shoulder affectionately, confidence grew. "She likes you," Clay observed. Leaning against the fence, animals are good judges of character. Their eyes met across Juniper's neck, and something electric passed between them. Abigail felt her breath catch, aware suddenly of how close they were standing. How the afternoon sun caught the gold flecks in Clay's blue eyes. The spell was broken by the sound of approaching hooves. A rider was coming up the lane, a man, in a sheriff's badge with a grim expression on his weathered face. "Clay Brannigan?" the sheriff called out as he dismounted. "Name's Sheriff Hawkins. I understand you had some trouble with Buckley's show last night." Clay moved protectively closer. To Abigail, his jaw tightening. "No trouble, Sheriff. I paid the man fair and square for Miss Whitmore's freedom." Hawkins spat in the dust. "That's what I figured, but Buckley's making noise about theft and kidnapping. Says the girl was taken against her will. That's a lie." Abigail stepped forward, her chin lifting defiantly. "Mr. Brannigan saved me from that monster. I went with him willingly." The sheriff studied her face, noting the fading bruises on her arms where Buckley's whip had found its mark. "I believe you, miss. But Buckley's got papers, a contract with your signature on it." "A contract signed under false pretenses," Abigail replied, her voice growing stronger. "Not what he forced me honest work, not what he forced me to become, Sheriff." Hawkins nodded slowly. "I've seen Buckley's type before. They prey on folks with nowhere else to turn. Problem is, the law ain't always clear on such matters." Looked at Clay meaningfully. "It might be best if the lady had somewhere to go, official-like. Buckley's planning to move on tomorrow, but he's the type to hold grudges." Clay understood the implication immediately. As long as Abigail remained unmarried and without family, she was vulnerable to Buckley's claims. But marriage would give her legal protection, make her Clay's responsibility in the eyes of the law. "We'll figure something out," Clay said carefully, not wanting to pressure Abigail. But as she looked at this man who'd already risked so much for her, Abigail realized that her heart had already made the decision. Her mind was still catching up. That evening, after Sheriff Hawkins had ridden away with promises to delay any legal proceedings for as long as possible, Clay and Abigail sat on the porch watching the sun paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. The weight of unspoken words hung between them like morning mist. "There's something I need to say," Abigail began, her hands folded tightly in her lap, "about what the sheriff suggested." Clay's jaw tensed. "Abigail, I don't want you to feel pressured into anything. What he was hinting at marriage, that's not something to be taken lightly, isn't it?" she asked, turning to face him. "Clay, in one day you've shown me more kindness than I received in 3 years with Buckley. You gave up your life savings for a stranger, offered your home to someone you barely knew. If that's not the foundation for something real, then I don't know what is." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Won't lie to you. I've thought about it. Not just as protection from Buckley, but ... double quotes." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm 32 years old, and I've never met a woman who made me want to change my solitary ways. Until now." Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. "What are you saying?" Clay stood up suddenly, pacing to the porch railing. "I'm saying that what I feel for you scares the hell out of me. I look at you and I see everything I never knew I wanted: a real home, not just a house. Someone to share the sunrise with, to plan a future with." He turned back to her, his eyes intense. "But you deserve better than a marriage born out of necessity. Don't I get to decide what I deserve?" Abigail rose and moved to stand before him. "Clay, I've been thinking too, about how safe I feel when you're near, how your smile makes me feel like I could be someone worth knowing again. Is it love? I don't know yet, it's too soon to say, but it could be. Given time, given a chance." He reached out and cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. "Are you sure? Once we're married, there's no going back. And I won't have you feeling trapped again, even by me. The only thing I'm trapped by is my own heart," she whispered. "I think it's already made. It's choice." Clay leaned down and kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was nothing like the rough advances she'd endured from Buckley's men, This was reverent, asking rather than taking. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily.
I'm alright tomorrow morning.
Clay said, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll ride into town and see the preacher." "If you're still certain." "I'm certain," Abigail replied without hesitation. They spent the rest of the evening talking about practical things, how they would merge their lives. What changes would need to be made to accommodate two people instead of one. But underneath, the practical discussion flowed an undercurrent of anticipation and nervous excitement. Clay slept by the fire again that night. But this time, neither of them minded. It felt proper, respectful, a courtship compressed into hours instead of months, no less meaningful for its brevity. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Abigail wore the blue dress Clay had given her, with wildflowers braided into her. Hair Clay had cleaned up as best he could, even shaving with his father's old razor. They rode into Willowbrook Township side by side, Abigail on Juniper and Clay on his stallion. Thunder Reverend Morrison was a kind man who'd known Clay since childhood. He asked a few questions and seemed to understand the urgency of the situation. The ceremony was simple, just the three of them in the small wooden church, with dust motes dancing in the colored light from the stained glass windows. When Clay slipped his mother's simple gold band onto Abigail's finger, she felt tears prick. Her eyes, not tears of sadness or fear, but of gratitude for this second chance at life, at happiness. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Morrison said with a smile. This time, when Clay kissed her, it was as her husband. And Abigail Whitmore Brannigan knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with this good man at her side. As they rode home as husband and wife, Buckley's wagons were disappearing over the eastern ridge, taking that chapter of Abigail's life with them forever. The first month of marriage brought challenges neither Clay nor Abigail had anticipated. They moved around each other carefully at first, like dancers learning new steps. Trying to merge two separate lives into something shared and harmonious, Abigail threw herself, aimed at making the cabin a true home. She sewed curtains from fabric Clay bought in town, planted a kitchen garden behind the house, and learned to cook on the temperamental wood stove. Her first attempts were disasters: burnt biscuits, oversalted stew, coffee strong enough to chew. Horse's butt Clay praised every effort with such genuine gratitude that her confidence grew daily. "You don't have to pretend it's good." She laughed one evening as Clay gamely chewed his way through a batch of experimental cornbread that had turned out more like edible rocks. "It's getting better every day," he insisted, washing it down with coffee. "Besides, I lived on my own cooking for years. Trust me, this is an improvement." Clay, meanwhile, found himself looking forward to coming home in ways he never had before. The cabin that had once been merely sheltered now felt alive with Abigail's presence. Hung wildflowers in mason jars, hummed while she worked, and had a way of making even ordinary evenings feel like celebrations. But it was in working with the horses that Abigail truly found her calling. Her initial fear gave way to fascination, then to genuine skill. She had an intuitive understanding of the animals that surprised even Clay. "Watch this," she said one afternoon, approaching a skittish mare that had been giving Clay trouble all week. Instead of using rope or force, Abigail simply stood still and spoke softly to the horse, her voice a gentle murmur that seemed to calm the animal's nerves. Within minutes, the mare was eating from her hand. "How did you do that?" Clay asked, impressed. Abigail shrugged, stroking the horse's neck. "I know what it's like to be afraid, to not know who you can trust. I just let her know she was safe." It was moments like these that made Clay fall deeper in love with his wife. It's not just her beauty, though. She grew more lovely to him every day, but her spirit. Her resilience, the way she approached everything with determination to not just survive, but to thrive. Their first real argument came 6 weeks into their marriage. Clay had been working late, trying to break a particularly stubborn stallion for a rancher in the next county. He came home exhausted, muddy, and short-tempered to find Abigail had spent the day rearranging the furniture. "I thought it would be nice to have the table by the window," she explained, gesturing to where she'd moved their dining area, "so we can watch the sunset while we eat." Clay surveyed the changes with tired eyes. Everything was different. Airs moved, rugs relocated, even his father's old pipe rack, shifted to a new spot on the mantel. For a man who'd lived alone for years, the changes felt overwhelming. "I liked it the way it was," he said more sharply than he intended. Abigail's face fell. "Oh," I thought. "I was just trying to make improvements." "I didn't ask for improvements," Clay snapped, then immediately regretted his words when he saw hurt flash across her features. They ate dinner in strained silence. The sunset Abigail had planned to share with him forgotten. Afterward, Clay stomped outside to tend the horses, leaving Abigail to clean up alone. It was past midnight when he finally came back in to find Abigail sitting by the fire, sewing. She looked up when he entered, but said nothing. "Abigail, Clay began, then stopped. How could he explain that it wasn't about the furniture at all, but about his fear of losing himself in this new life they were building? "You put everything back," he noticed, looking around at the returned original arrangement. "It's your home," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. "I had no right to change things without asking." Clay sank into the chair across from her, suddenly feeling like the world's biggest fool. "No, that's not Abigail. Look at me." When she raised her eyes, he saw tears threatening. "It's our home now, yours and mine. You had every right to arrange it, however makes you happy." "But you said I said a lot of stupid things because I was tired and taking my frustrations out on you." Clay leaned forward, reaching for her hands. "The truth is, having the table by the window is a fine idea. Having dinner while watching the sunset sounds perfect. I was just ... scared, I guess." "Scared of what?" Clay struggled to put his feelings into words. "Of changing so much I forget who I am. Of not being the man you fell in love with." Abigail set down her sewing and moved to kneel beside his chair. "Clay Brannigan, the man I fell in love with, is kind and patient and considerate. The man who snapped at me tonight because he was tired and overwhelmed. That's human. I can love both versions of you." He pulled her up into his lap, holding her close. "I'm sorry. I'll try to do better." "We'll both try to do better," she corrected. "That's what marriage is, isn't it? Learning to dance together." From that night forward, their partnership grew stronger. They learned to communicate before making changes, to share their fears and frustrations instead of letting them fester. And yes, they moved the table back to the window, where they spent many evenings watching the sun set over their growing dreams by autumn. The Brannigan Ranch had become one of the most respected horse operations in the territory. Word had spread about Clay's skill as a trainer and Abigail's uncanny ability to calm even the most fractious animals. Orders poured in from ranchers, cavalry officers, and even wealthy families from back east who wanted quality mounts. But success brought its own challenges. One October morning, a stranger rode up to their property, a well-dressed man with cold eyes and an expensive gun on his hip. "You Clay Brannigan?" the man asked, not bothering to dismount. "I am," Clay replied, stepping protectively in front of Abigail, who'd been hanging laundry on the line. Something about the stranger set his teeth on edge. "Name's Vance Carruthers. I represent certain business interests that might be interested in purchasing your operation." "It's not for sale," Clay said flatly. Carruthers smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Brannigan. Just a matter of finding the right price." His gaze shifted to Abigail, lingering in a way that made Clay's blood boil. "Though I can see why you might be reluctant to leave such pleasant surroundings." "I think you'd better move along," Clay said, his voice deadly quiet. "Oh, I'll be back," Carruthers replied, finally spurring his horse. "Men like you always come around eventually, especially when they realize how dangerous this country can be for folks living out here all alone." That night, Clay told Abigail about similar visits other ranchers had received. A railroad company was trying to buy up land for a new line, using increasingly aggressive tactics when simple offers failed. "What do they want with our land specifically?" Abigail asked as they sat on the porch, Clay cleaning his rifle. "Water rights," Clay explained. "Our stream feeds into the river. Control the water, control everything downstream." Over the next few weeks, the pressure intensified. Fences were cut, allowing their horses to wander. Strange men were spotted watching the ranch from the hills. One morning, they found one of their prized stallions with a cut on his leg not deep enough to permanently injure, but clearly a warning. Maybe we should consider their offer, Abigail said after the incident with the horse. If staying here puts us in danger, no, Clay said firmly. This is our home, our life. I won't be driven off by bullies and thieves. But the final confrontation came sooner than expected. Clay was in town buying supplies when Carruthers and 3 armed men rode onto the ranch property. Abigail was alone, working with a young mare in the corral. Well, Carruthers called out, dismounting. The lovely Mrs. Brannigan, all by herself. I see. Abigail's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. My husband will be back soon. I don't think so. Carruthers smirked. You see, we made sure Mr. Brannigan would be ... delayed. In town today, something about his horse throwing a shoe, I believe. The mare, sensing Abigail's fear, began to prance nervously. Without thinking, Abigail vaulted onto the horse's back something. She'd been practicing in secret as a surprise for Clay. Oh, now, Carruthers said, pulling his gun. No need for dramatics. Just want to have a civilized conversation about your future here. But Abigail was already moving. She guided the mare in a tight circle, then suddenly charged straight at Carruthers. The horse, responding to her rider's determination, knocked the man flat and sent his gun spinning into the dust. As his men scrambled for their weapons, Abigail whistled a sharp, piercing sound that brought every horse on the ranch running. The corral gates swung open, and suddenly Carruthers and his men were surrounded by a dozen spooked horses, all stamping and snorting. In the chaos, Abigail grabbed Clay's rifle from where it hung by the barn door. When the dust settled, she found herself looking down the barrel at 4 very surprised and increasingly nervous men. I believe you gentlemen are trespassing, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. That was how Clay found them 20 minutes later, Carruthers and his men sitting in the dirt with their hands up, while his wife held them at gunpoint from horseback like some kind of frontier Amazon. Having trouble, honey? Clay asked mildly, though his eyes blazed with pride and fury in equal measure. Nothing I couldn't handle, Abigail replied, never taking her eyes off their captives. Sheriff Hawkins arrived shortly after, having been summoned by concerned townspeople who'd seen the confrontation begin. Carruthers and his men were arrested for trespassing and attempted intimidation, and the railroad company quietly withdrew their interest in the area after the incident became public knowledge. That night, as they sat by the fire, Clay marveled at the woman he'd married. Where did you learn to ride like that? Abigail smiled mysteriously. I've been practicing. Thought you might like to see what your student had learned. She grew serious. Clay, I never want to be helpless again. Today proved I don't have to. He pulled her close, his heart full of love and admiration. Abigail Brannigan, you are the strongest woman I've ever known, and the bravest. Outside, their horses grazed peacefully in the moonlight, and the stream that had nearly cost them everything continued its eternal song toward the river and the sea. 5 years later, the Brannigan Ranch had grown into something neither Clay nor Abigail could have imagined on that first night when he'd rescued her from Buckley's traveling show. What had started as a modest horse-breaking operation had expanded into a renowned breeding program, with buyers coming from as far away as Chicago and San Francisco to purchase their animals. But the greatest expansion had been in their hearts. Little Catherine, now 3 years old, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn curls, chased chickens around the yard while her baby brother Thomas napped in the cradle Clay had carved from oak. A third child was already growing under Abigail's heart, due to arrive with the spring wildflowers. Mama, Mama. Look, Catherine called out, pointing to where a new foal was taking its first wobbly steps in the pasture. Baby horse is learning to walk. Abigail smiled, one hand resting on her expanding belly as she watched her daughter's excitement. The morning sickness had been worse this time, but Clay had taken over the early chores without complaint, bringing her coffee in bed and handling the horses until she felt strong enough to join him. Just like you learned to walk, little one, Abigail called back. Remember? Gentle movements around the new baby. Clay emerged from the barn, hay in his hair and a grin on his face. At 37, he was even more handsome than the day he'd married her, his face weathered by sun and laughter lines, his body still strong from hard work. But it was the contentment in his eyes that made Abigail's heart skip the look of a man completely at peace with his life. "Morning, Mrs. Brannigan," he said, stealing a kiss as he passed. "How are you feeling today?" "Like I could eat everything in the county," she laughed. "This baby seems to have quite an appetite." "Good thing I shot that deer yesterday," Clay said, settling beside her on the porch swing he'd built for their second anniversary. "Thomas has been eating us out of house and home too." So if summoned by his name, baby Thomas chose that moment to wake with a lusty cry that sent the chickens scattering. Clay rose to fetch him, and Abigail watched with never-ending amazement as her strong, capable husband transformed into the gentlest of fathers, cooing nonsense words to their son. "Papa," Catherine declared, abandoning the chickens to climb into Clay's free arm. "Tell the story. Tell the story about Mama and the bad men." It had become a family tradition, the tale of how Mama had faced down Carruthers and his gang while riding bareback. Clay embellished it more each time, until Abigail had become a legend in their daughter's mind. "Well," Clay began, settling into his chair with a child in each arm. "It was a dark and stormy day." "It was bright sunshine," Abigail corrected with a laugh. "When your Mama, the bravest woman in all the territory, faced down for armed desperadoes with nothing but her wit and her way with horses." As Clay spun the familiar tale, Abigail let her mind wander to that long-ago night when she'd been trapped with Buckley's show, praying for rescue. She could never have imagined then that her salvation would come in the form of a quiet rancher with kind eyes and calloused hands, or that together they would build something so beautiful, so lasting. Their success had brought offers, developers wanting to buy their land for a new town site, wealthy investors promising to make them rich if they'd relocate to Denver or San Francisco, but Abigail and Clay had turned them all down. This was home, this valley with its stream and cottonwoods, where their children were learning to walk and ride and dream. Ow. "And then what happened, Papa?" Catherine demanded, as Clay's story reached its climax. "Then your Mama showed those bad men that Brannigan women are not to be trifled with," Clay said solemnly. "They rode away and never came back because they knew they'd met their match." "Will I be brave like Mama when I grow up?" Catherine asked. "Braver," Clay assured her, "because you'll have her teaching you from the very beginning." That afternoon, while the children napped, Clay and Abigail rode out to check on the horses in the far pasture. It was something they did every few days, partly for the ranch work, but mostly for the chance to be alone together, to remember the couple they'd been before they became parents. They found their prize stallion, Thunder's Pride, grazing with his mares beside the stream where Clay had first heard Abigail's cries for help all those years ago. The horse lifted his magnificent head as they approached, whinnying a greeting. "Hard to believe it all started here," Abigail mused. Dismounting to let her horse drink from the clear water, Clay joined her, slipping his arms around her waist from behind. "Best $200 I ever spent. Is that all I was worth?" she teased, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Priceless," he corrected, pressing his lips to her temple. "Absolutely priceless." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching their horses and thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the ashes of Abigail's captivity and Clay's solitude, they had built something extraordinary. Love that. Had weathered every storm, a family that grew stronger each day, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. "Clay," Abigail said softly. "Yes, darling. Thank you for saving me, for loving me, for building this beautiful life with me." He turned her in his arms, looking down into the green eyes that had captured his heart that first night in Buckley's tent. "Abigail, you saved me too. I was just existing before you came along, going through the motions of living without really being alive. You taught me what it means to have something worth fighting for, worth building for." As the sun began to set over their valley, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Clay and Abigail knew they had found what so many people spent their whole lives searching for, a love that was both passionate and peaceful. A partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. In the distance, they could hear Catherine's laughter as she played with the barn cats, and Thomas babbling happily to himself as he discovered his own fingers. Soon there would be another voice added to the symphony of their family, another heart to love and protect and nurture. "Come on," Clay said, taking Abigail's hand. "Let's go home." As they rode back toward the cabin, where smoke was already rising, from the chimney and lamplight glowed golden in the windows, Abigail reflected on the miracle of her life. She had started as a prisoner, become a performer against her will, and ended as the wife of the finest man she'd ever known. From the darkest period of her existence had come the greatest joy she could have imagined. The traveling show was a distant memory now, as insubstantial as morning mist. What mattered was the steady rhythm of hoofbeats carrying them home, the warmth of Clay's hand in hers, the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. That night, after the children were asleep and the horses were settled for the night, Clay and Abigail sat on their porch swing, Abigail's head on Clay's shoulder, as they watched the stars appear one by one in the vast Montana sky. "Any regrets?" Clay asked softly, a question he posed sometimes when the evening was particularly peaceful. "Only one," Abigail replied, tilting her face up to look at him. Clay's heart skipped, even after 5 years of marriage. "What's that?" "It took Buckley's cruelty to bring us together," she said. "I wish we could have found each other some other way." Clay considered this, then shook his head. "I don't think we would have. I was too set in my ways, too comfortable being alone. And you were an innocent girl who deserved to see something of the world before settling down. Maybe we both needed to walk through some darkness to appreciate the light we found in each other." Abigail smiled, her hand finding his where it rested on her stomach. "Then I suppose everything happened exactly as it was meant to." Above them, a shooting star streaked across the heavens, and they both made the same silent wish for many more years of love, laughter, and the simple joy of waking up each morning beside the person who made their heart complete in the cabin. Behind them, their children slept peacefully, surrounded by the security of parents who loved them and each other. And in the pastures around them, their horses grazed contentedly under the starlight. Testament to the dream two lonely souls had built together from nothing more than hope, determination, and a love that had proven stronger than any force that tried to tear it apart. The Cowhand had saved the girl from the traveling show, just as the townspeople would tell the story for generations to come. But the real truth, the one Clay and Abigail carried in their hearts, was that they had saved each other, and in doing so, had built not just a home, but a legacy that would endure as long as love existed in the world.